Okay, welcome to the 5-Minute Podcast review for Monday, March 12, 2018. Another 5 podcast to introduce you to, and links to all are on your screen. First up is This Won't Hurt a Bit. The clue's in the name. This is a medical podcast, but it's not aimed at doctors or med students. It's aimed at everyone. The show notes for This Won't Hurt a Bit describe it as the medical podcast for your cortex and funny bone. So, hosted by 2 doctors, each episode deals with a broad medical topic like things you find in the ER, holiday mishaps, food poisoning, and foreign bodies, otherwise known as things that are found in places they shouldn't be. The host doctors relate stories from their own careers and occasionally bring in other medical experts with their own stories to tell. Overall, the conversations and stories are entertaining and usually funny, though I have to say it can sometimes be extremely squeamish listening. Here are clips from 2 of my top squeamish moments so far.
This patient comes in who happens to be an incarcerated patient.
Oh, yes.
And so the law enforcement officer comes to get the doctor and says, "Can you please come see him? He's got something in his eye." I was like, "Sure, what's in his eye?" And the officer said, "There's a staple in his eye."
Okay, staple in the eye.
So I'm kind of like, I don't believe this. This sounds a little ridiculous to me. And I said, "Okay, well, let me take a look." He opens his eyes and I say, "Follow my finger." And as I bring his gaze to the side, so he's now looking to the left, out from the corner of his right eye pops a staple. It turns the corner and then he goes, "Ow!" And he grabs his eye and it like tucks back in and it goes back in. A few years ago, he had shoved 5 or 6 staples to the side of his eye, and then he tried to get them out, and they were gone. They were just stuck back there.
Oh,
yeah,
crazy!
And
Why?
they finally
and he
started
did it
to come
because
out.
he was actively psychotic at the time, or what was it?
I don't know if he was kind of an in and out of jail kind of guy. Maybe he wanted to just have a little bit of a tool on hand,
a little
just
hardware.
like pull it out when he needed it. So,
yeah, can't pick a lot of locks with staples.
No, but
I'm just thinking.
maybe he's thinking I could dig out, or he
Yeah,
needs a
I don't-
weapon.
You're going to dig it out of Shawshank with that?
he couldn't even dig him out of his eye.
Okay, so from staples in the eyeball to, well, just have a listen to this one.
So a young Asian man comes in presenting to the emergency department, and he says, "Hey, I'm having some bloody diarrhea." I'm like, "Sure, we get a lot of people who have that, and how do we work that up?" He's like, "But I really want to get treated for worms." I was like, "Worms? Really?" He's like, "Oh yeah, worms." And I don't know, I get asked this a lot. A lot of patients come up and say, "I want to be treated for worms and this." And he goes, "No, I really want to get treated for worms." And I see next to him, he's got this little grocery bag, plastic bag sitting next to him. I'm like, "Did you bring me something?" I was like, "I hope that's not a stool sample." He goes, "No, it's the worm." I'm like, "Well, in that case, let's come take a look at it." So first thing I do is just take a look. I open it up and I take out a toilet paper roll, or just that little brown centerpiece of what's left over a toilet paper roll. And wrapped around it is, of course, this giant, long, what looks like a flat tapeworm. Just sitting in there. I'm like, oh, I was like, okay. And it's like, "That came out of your bottom?" It's like, "Yes, that came out of my bottom."
Oh my gosh.
So he goes, "Okay, so I'm having diarrhea. I had a little abdominal pain and cramping, and I'm having some diarrhea. Then I had some bloody diarrhea." So he gets a little nervous. And then after he has a lot of bloody diarrhea, he says, "I look down and I look like there's a piece of intestine hanging out of me."
Oh God.
And you know what's racing through his mind is he thinks he's dying.
Right.
Because he's having bloody diarrhea.
Like his
now
entrails are just
it's just
spilling
coming
out. Right.
Exactly. He is scared to death that he's like got something terrible. So he's like, "Oh my goodness, my guts are coming out from me." So he's just like, he grabs it and he pulls on it and it keeps coming out. And it's like, "And what is this long piece of entrail?" And he picks it up and looks at it. And what does it do? It starts moving.
Okay, so This Won't Hurt a Bit is not all stories like these. Most episodes are much easier listening, but all are interesting. Episodes are a bit sporadic, which is not uncommon for podcasts produced by people who have day jobs, especially doctors. But lately, episodes have been dropping about once a month. So if I've sold you on This Won't Hurt a Bit, you can check it out using the link I've put on your screen. All right, shifting gears into the world of David Bowie with a new podcast called The A to Z of Bowie, or if you're in the US, you might call it The A to Z of David Bowie. But since this is a British podcast, let's stick with A to Z. And incidentally, just how long ago do you think it was that David Bowie died? I was thinking it was early last year, maybe 8 to 10 months ago. Actually, it was more than 2 years ago. He died on the 10th of January 2016. So time really does fly. Anyhow, back to the A to Z of David Bowie. This is a new podcast launched mid-January this year and is hosted by two UK music journalists, Mark Riley and Rob Hughes, and probably needless to say, both are big David Bowie fans. As the title makes clear, the podcast uses the alphabet format to go episode by episode from A to Z through the world of David Bowie, and I actually think this format works better than, say, going chronologically through Bowie's life and career. It's just maybe makes it a bit more of an interesting random listen, especially for the casual Bowie fan, rather than getting bogged down at the start with episodes on the early years of Bowie or whatever. So under the A of Bowie, we have subjects as specific as Ashes to Ashes and as broad as America. The show notes for the A to Z of David Bowie describe the hosts as, quote, rifling through the fascinating world of one of the greatest rock stars. And that's a good description of what the first few episodes have so far delivered. The hosts, Mark and Rob, clearly have a lot of interesting facts, figures, stories and trivia on Bowie, so much so that the episodes up to the moment, the A, B and C episodes, have actually taken 2 episodes each. And that's a trend that's likely to continue. So we could end up with closer to 50 episodes rather than 26. Right now, it's still early days for the podcast, still in the seas of David Bowie, so a good time to jump in with a few episodes to get going and plenty more to come. You don't have to be a diehard Bowie fan to like this podcast. I'm no diehard Bowie fan, but if you're of a certain age, as they say, and David Bowie has kind of been there in the background of your life, you'll find the A to Z of David Bowie something interesting and something different to add to your playlist. Okay, on to the next podcast, which is it the third podcast for this episode? Anyhow, it's the No Film School podcast. If you're a filmmaker, particularly an independent filmmaker or have an interest in filmmaking, you might already know about No Film School, particularly its long-running website. No Film School is an online, worldwide community of filmmakers, producers and independent creatives who share and learn from each other everything about making films with, quote, no film school required. As a person involved in the film industry myself, who never went to film school, it's a seriously great resource. And now, in fact, actually since January 2016, there's the No Film School podcast. Now, I had to look back on my own episode list just to double check I hadn't already covered No Film School, but it seems like I haven't, even though I'm a regular listener, so better late than never. The No Film School podcast is just super valuable listening for anyone connected with or interested in filmmaking. Episodes cover a huge range from equipment reviews and recommendations for filmmaking apps to deep dives on scripting and developing your film, directing, working with actors, raising funding, and just a whole lot more. Seriously, the No Film School podcast and its website are the next best thing to actually working on a film and learning on the job, or, I guess, going to film school. So if you've got an interest in filmmaking or are already working in the industry in any capacity, make sure you subscribe to the No Film School podcast. And you can do this using the link on your screen. So sticking with things kind of technical and kind of creative for a minute leads me to the next podcast this episode, which is the Podcast Engineering Show. Now, if you've ever been involved in creating a podcast, you're very likely to relate to just how compelling certain discussions on topics you've never really cared about before can suddenly become, like endless and inconclusive talk on the nuances of different microphones. That's a big one. Or the best microphone technique, the best editing software, the best settings, EQing, leveling, the mysteries of LUFS, all that sort of stuff. You get views on all this and more on the Podcast Engineering Show. Most episodes have a guest, sometimes a guest with a professional expertise like an audio engineer, or often a guest who is the host of their own podcast, maybe one you listen to. And this means inevitably indulging in the almost voyeuristic-like thrill, at least to podcasters, of hearing a rundown on the gear a fellow podcaster has, as well as the workflow they use to get their podcast out, and comparing all of that to your own. Overall, the Podcast Engineering Show has the noble aim of improving the sound quality of all podcasts, which is something that podcast listeners, as well as podcast creators, should be happy about. So if you're a podcast creator and not completely happy with your sound, or just want to hear how everyone else is doing it, get on to the Podcast Engineering Show. Righto, quick one to end on, and it's the Atlantic Interview. This is, like the name suggests, an interview podcast, but if you're familiar with The Atlantic magazine and its 160-year history of interviews with, to use The Atlantic's own words, some of the world's most consequential figures, you'll probably be interested in the podcast version. Each episode runs about 30 minutes and focuses on an individual interviewee, with the interview conducted by multi-award-winning journalist and current editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg. Jeffrey Goldberg has a familiarity and a rapport with most of his interview subjects, often having interviewed them a number of times before, and he does a great job of creating a disarming conversation where the subjects open up a bit more than usual, and it seems speak in a way that recognises the calibre of conversation that Atlantic readers probably enjoy. Anyhow, a good entry point is to download and listen to a recent February 13 interview with Bill Gates. The interview springboards off the 2018 annual letter from Bill and Melinda Gates and makes for interesting and insightful, even cleverly diplomatic listening, as Bill Gates carefully responds to questions about his thoughts on Donald Trump and Trump's America First views that could be seen as conflicting with the broader global aims of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And there's a nice piece at the end of the interview where Bill Gates tells us just how he's coping with no longer being the richest person on the planet. So that's the Atlantic interview, worth a listen if you're into good long-formish interviews, and that's another episode of the 5-Minute Podcast Review just about done. Quick reminder, we covered This Won't Hurt a Bit, the A to Z of David Bowie, No Film School, the Podcast Engineering Show, and the Atlantic interview. You can find these wherever you get your podcasts, or as always, just use the links already on your phone screen. Unless you're listening on Spotify, that is. The links don't work on Spotify, not yet anyway, but maybe that will change one day soon. Also, you'll find an email address for me on your screen, so please get in touch, especially with any podcast suggestions, including your own podcast if you have one. I'm slowly working my way through some great suggestions that have already been sent in. Okay, that is it. See you in the next episode, and thanks for listening.